We're diving into something pretty extraordinary, an event that unfolded over a Labor Day weekend, actually. It felt almost like a legal thriller playing out in real time. Just imagine this. Hundreds of kids, some, as young as 7, being quietly prepped for deportation, middle of the night, across multiple states, and then suddenly their journey is stopped cold by a federal judge. It sounds, I don't know, like a movie scene, but this was very real, an urgent crisis. So our mission today is to unpack this major legal setback. It was against a controversial immigration policy during the Trump administration, and it directly impacted more than 600 Guatemalan children. We're going to explore that frantic, overnight legal battle that stopped it. We'll delve into some of the stories, the human side of the vulnerable children caught right in the middle, and we'll examine the broader implications for immigration law, for child welfare. By the end of this deep dive, you'll get the immediate actions, the legal arguments, which are pretty nuanced, and maybe understand why this specific intervention raises such fundamental questions about how we treat, well, the most vulnerable people. Get ready for a story with some surprising facts, sharp legal twists, and I think powerful insights into the human cost of immigration policy.
Yeah, the sheer audacity of how this went down and then the lightning speed of the legal response. It really stands out. It's just such a stark illustration of how critical these vigilant legal advocates are, protecting rights that were, in this case, really on the verge of being, well, profoundly violated.
That speed, definitely. It speaks volumes about the advocates. But it also paints this picture of extreme urgency from the government side, too, right? Like a race against the clock to get this done. So let's unpack that. This midnight maneuver and the emergency stop. The scene, well, by all accounts, it was chaotic and very secretive. You had ICE agents, contractors showing up at children's shelters, Texas, Arizona, other places too. And we're talking really short notice, sometimes just 2 or 3 hours, often, like you said, smack in the middle of the night. The goal, pick up these kids, put them on planes straight to Guatemala.
And crucially, this wasn't just some random thing that topped up. The legal service providers, the attorneys who represent these kids, they started noticing, well, on things, as they put it, specifically for Guatemalan kids. Their court dates, the dates they were supposed to see at immigration judge, they just started disappearing from the system.
Disappearing.
Yeah, just gone.
Good.
And that's apparently a known red flag.
Yeah.
It's a pretty clear sign that a child is about to be removed, deported. So these advocates, they talked to each other, right? They started comparing notes, sounding the alarm, and that's how they figured out what was happening so fast.
Wow. Okay. But the response is where it really turns, isn't it? The legal counterstrike. The National Immigration Law Center, NILC, they launched this incredibly urgent response, filed a 25-page complaint at 1 a.m. Think about that, 1 in the morning, on a holiday weekend. Their argument was crystal clear. These kids had active immigration cases, active, across the country. And trying to repatriate them like this, it violates federal law, violates the Constitution. They called the government's actions, I think the words were unlawful and reckless.
Yeah, and that complaint probably laid out specific constitutional issues like due process violations and statutory arguments, too, based on laws already in place to protect unaccompanied minors. And the urgency of that filing, it worked. It led to an initial emergency ruling. Came down around 4:30 a.m. from a federal judge.
4:30 a.m.?
Yeah. But even with that order, some kids were still put on planes.
Seriously? After a judge's order?
Apparently so. Which, that kind of defiance prompted another hearing later that day, around 12:30 p.m. And that's when the federal judge finally issued a really definitive halt, a temporary restraining order, a TRO. It stopped all removals of Guatemalan children in custody for 14 days.
That timeline is just incredible. It really tells you something.
It does. When a federal judge issues an emergency halt at 4:30 a.m. on a holiday weekend, it signals that the court sees a legal violation that's so serious, so urgent, that you just can't wait for normal court processes. It wasn't just like a paperwork mistake. It was seen as a crisis of rights unfolding right then and there. The court clearly recognized an immediate severe threat to these kids' protections.
That swiftness from the judge, it speaks volumes, suggests the court saw that immediate threat you mentioned. Now, the administration had often claimed its crackdowns targeted, quote, the worst of the worst, dangerous criminals, that was the rhetoric. But let's get beyond the rhetoric. Who were the actual faces of this plan, the kids involved here?
Right, that's the critical question, isn't it? Who exactly are the worst of the worst in this context? NILC's complaint, it brought that question right to the forefront with a really poignant example. It humanized the whole thing. They talked to an unnamed 10-year-old indigenous girl, just initials, LG.
10 years old.
10. Her story is just heartbreaking. She speaks a rare indigenous language, was being held in a shelter in Texas. Her mother had passed away, and she'd suffered horrific abuse and neglect from other caregivers back home.
Oh my gosh.
This child, this vulnerable 10-year-old girl with that kind of trauma, no mom left in Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
She was one of the ones about to be put on a plane, sent back. Her situation alone just makes the idea of some kind of voluntary repatriation seem completely implausible.
Absolutely implausible. And it wasn't just like teenagers, right? You mentioned kids as young as 7 were part of this.
As young as 7. It was apparently so extreme that some of the younger children, they couldn't even really provide a proper declaration for the lawsuit. Their attention spans, the trauma.
Like, you try explaining your deepest fears, your whole legal case, to a lawyer when you're 7 years old, right?
Exactly. It just highlights how incredibly vulnerable these minors were, basically unable to advocate for themselves in this massively complex legal system.
And there's supposed to be protections, right? You mentioned established processes.
Yeah, for almost 20 years now. And with strong bipartisan support, I should add. U.S. law has given children a critical chance. The chance to make their case to an immigration judge. It's not just a nice gesture. It's about due process. That fundamental right to a fair hearing.
Okay.
For these kids, that means they get to tell their story. Explain why they're scared to go back. Why returning might put them in danger. Instead of just being put on a plane, no questions asked. And look, many of these children have really compelling legal claims. Some are seeking asylum, meaning they fear persecution back home. That's life or death stuff. Others might qualify for a special kind of visa, an SIJ visa, if they've suffered abuse, abandonment, or neglect. It's a specific path to safety.
So their situations are all different.
Very individual.
Totally different. And each one deserves to be looked at individually, not just swept up in some mass deportation designed purely for speed. So to suddenly grab hundreds of kids in the middle of the night, put them on planes, it completely sidesteps that whole established, legally backed process. So a story like LG's, it really serves as this powerful counter-narrative. It forces you to confront who's actually affected by these broad policies.
Yeah, and whether that worst of the worst line holds any water in reality.
Right. So the human face, LG's face, definitely complicates the official story. Speaking of which, let's look at the government's justification, because that came under pretty heavy fire in court, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. In court, the government's line was, basically, this is just repatriation. That's the word they used, which implies, a voluntary return, often government-assisted, usually started by the person or their family.
Okay.
They claimed they were just reuniting kids with their parents in Guatemala at the parents' request, and that this whole plan had been in the works for weeks.
But the judge wasn't buying that.
Not really. The judge challenged that narrative very quickly. The core question was pretty simple. If this was a planned voluntary repatriation, genuinely worked out over weeks, why do it in the middle of the night? Why give the kids' lawyers only 2 hours' notice? Why the obvious, undeniable urgency to get them onto planes?
Yeah, the secrecy, the rush. It doesn't exactly scream voluntary reunification.
Precisely. It reveals that critical tension, When the official story clashes so dramatically with what people actually see happening on the ground, it erodes trust. It demands closer scrutiny. The urgency, the secrecy, especially combined with the administration's stated goals at the time, it suggested a motive that maybe wasn't primarily about child welfare.
So what was the suggested motive then?
Well, Efren Olivares from NILC, he offered his view pretty bluntly in reports. He believed it was, quote, nothing more than their agenda to deport as many black and brown people from this country. He suggested the government had likely cut some kind of specific deal with the Guatemalan government to make this rapid removal happen, which would explain why they started specifically with Guatemalan children. It wasn't random. It was targeted.
And that raises fears about other countries, right? If there's a deal with Guatemala.
Exactly. That specific action immediately sparked fears among advocacy groups. Is Guatemala just the first? There had been other, often pretty controversial agreements before, with El Salvador, even Mexico. Deals that caused a lot of concern.
What kind of deals?
Sometimes called asylum cooperation agreements or safe third country deals. Basically, they let the U.S. send asylum seekers to those countries, arguing they could seek protection there instead of here, often without fully hearing their claim in the U.S.
I see.
So while this initial 14-day order protected the Guatemalan kids, it didn't automatically protect kids from, say, Honduras, or El Salvador at that moment. Advocates were really worried this policy was about to expand.
So the key takeaway there is you have to weigh the official explanations against the actual actions you see.
Absolutely. And these specific, often kind of opaque deals between the U.S. and other countries about migrants, especially kids, when they involve secrecy and urgency like this, the implications are huge and concerning because they could potentially bypass established legal rights.
Those are crucial points. And it highlights the strategic thinking needed from these advocacy groups. It also brings up the broader context, doesn't it? International agreements, global norms.
Yeah.
Where does the U.S. actually stand on some of these things, particularly regarding children?
Yeah, that's a really important layer here. There's a whole body of international human rights law specifically focused on children. The big one, the main treaty, is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Okay, the UN Convention.
But here's the really crucial detail, and it's quite stark on the global stage. The United States has not ratified this convention. We haven't signed on to it.
We haven't. The U.S. isn't part of that.
Nope. The U.S. is actually a major outlier, one of only a tiny handful of countries in the entire world, often alongside nations with, let's say, very different human rights records that haven't ratified this key treaty on children's rights.
Wow. Why is that significant?
Well, by not ratifying, the U.S. essentially avoids the direct legal obligations and the international accountability that come with signing on. It gives the government more leeway, you could say, in its policies towards children, including child migrants, compared to countries that are bound by the convention.
That's a huge point. And it definitely shapes the legal and ethical discussion here. So this convention, which almost every other country has signed, what's its guiding principle?
It's actually guided by a very simple but really powerful principle: the best interests of the child.
The best interests of the child.
Yeah, it sounds basic, right? Common sense.
Yeah.
That any government decision, any policy that affects a child should prioritize their well-being, put their interests first.
Yeah, it does sound fundamental. So how did that principle apply here in this situation?
Well, in this specific case, it was abundantly clear, certainly to the courts and the child advocates, that the government's actions were seen as, frankly, blatantly violating that principle. These kids, as we've discussed, they have diverse, complex situations. Some have active asylum cases, serious life and death protection issues. Others might have no parents, or only one, maybe making them eligible for that special visa, the SIJ visa, designed to protect vulnerable kids. Others might have suffered terrible abuse or trafficking.
Right. Their individual stories matter hugely.
Exactly. Their situations vary so much. And the argument was the government simply hadn't considered those individual best interests in any meaningful way before trying this mass deportation. Instead, the focus seems squarely on, well, speed, getting as many kids on planes as possible without any real regard for their specific legal claims or their personal vulnerabilities.
So the fact that the U.S. hasn't signed the convention, it creates space for policies that might clash with that global standard.
That's the implication, yeah. When a powerful nation opts out of a widely accepted international treaty like that, it can lead to policies that, judged by global norms, might seem to disregard the best interests of the child. It creates a unique and often really challenging legal and ethical landscape for child migrants within U.S. borders.
That distinction is so important for understanding the whole picture, both here and how the U.S. fits globally. Okay, so this 14-day TRO, the temporary restraining order, it was a critical pause button. But what happens next for these kids, for the legal battle? What happens after a temporary block like this?
Right, so the immediate first step from the court was quite specific. The government was ordered to report back, confirming that any kids who were mistakenly or maybe deliberately put on planes despite that first 4:30 a.m. ruling had been brought back to their shelters.
Okay, so accountability for defying the initial order.
Exactly. A direct order to fix any actions taken after that first emergency halt. But looking ahead, yeah, that 14-day TRO, it really is just the beginning. Think of it like hitting pause on the immediate crisis. The real legal fight, the marathon, unfolds over the next weeks and potentially months. There was extensive legal briefings scheduled right away.
What does that involve?
That's where NILC and the other advocates lay out their full case in writing. Detailed arguments, citing specific laws, constitutional protections, arguing for a more permanent protection, like a preliminary injunction. And that wouldn't just protect these specific 600 Guatemalan kids, potentially, but maybe a whole class of vulnerable minors who could face similar actions down the road.
Ah, so broadening the protection.
Potentially.
But yeah.
So after that 14-day period, the court has to make another more substantive decision. Do they extend the protection? Do they modify it? Or do they maybe dissolve the order? It's not just about one judge's initial reaction. It's about potentially setting a precedent that reinforces the rights of all children caught up in the immigration system.
So the fight is definitely not over, and it has these much wider implications.
But far from over. And advocacy groups, you can bet they remain incredibly vigilant.
No.
Worried about similar actions against kids from other countries, especially given those other agreements we talk about with places like El Salvador.
Yeah.
It just underscores that the legal battle for these children's rights is continuous,
Yeah.
often an uphill struggle.
It really makes you appreciate how these individual court cases connect to bigger policy shifts and the critical role these lawyers play, right? Protecting vulnerable people, often working literally through the night to stop what they see as, grave injustices. Okay, so we've navigated a really complex story today. Legal, human, from the swift overnight government actions to the equally swift intervention by the courts and these dedicated advocates. It's such a striking reminder, isn't it? How quickly lives can be turned upside down, especially for the most vulnerable, and how absolutely crucial legal protections and the people who fight for them are in a functioning democracy. This deep dive, I think, has shown us how policy decisions hit the most vulnerable, and how a nation's stance on international human rights can really set it apart on the world stage.
Indeed. And it really prompts us to think, doesn't it? What does it truly mean to uphold the best interests of the child in practice, especially when those children are crossing borders, often carrying incredibly difficult histories and compelling reasons for seeking safety? And maybe what responsibility does a society have to make sure every child, no matter where they're from or what their perceived legal status is, gets that fundamental chance, the chance to have their story heard, their case properly looked at, before decisions are made that will literally shape the entire rest of their lives?
And maybe even more broadly, how do we as a society find that balance between, national sovereignty, border enforcement, and universal human dignity, and the internationally recognized rights of children, especially in these complex, often really emotionally charged situations? We really encourage you to reflect on those questions and maybe continue your own deep dive into how legal systems and human rights intersect, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable people among us.